Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Now, so far in this presentation, I have tried my best to leave out any kinds of metaphysical disputes. I believe for most people, metaphysical disputes are secondary to the pressing, real-world, immediate issues surrounding any particular topic. And really, in my mind, sound metaphysics is just rigorous common sense and heed for ubiquitous empirical observation. So, I do take issue with any kinds of systems of metaphysics that attempt to deny the obvious, and especially the obvious on which our everyday experience and argumentation relies. And one such claim that has been made by a YouTube user named early2it, but also I'm sure is shared by at least a few other people, is, I believe, an absurd metaphysical claim. Absurd because it flies in the face of basic reality and is a performative contradiction. The claim is that it is death that is real and life is an illusion. Now, I grant you that death is real. Death is the cessation of life, and that does happen. But life itself is not an illusion. First of all, I'd like to point out the performative contradiction in this. Now, anybody who argues that life is an illusion has to be alive in order to do so, because a dead person cannot argue, a non-living person or a non-living thing cannot argue. So in order to claim that there is no life, one needs to be alive in the first place. Now, if one doesn't believe that life is real, if one considers life to be an illusion, then also one has to essentially be in an irresolvable contradiction. One is claiming that life is an illusion, which means that one is claiming that one's own life is an illusion, as well as the life of the person with whom one is arguing. So what's the point of the argument? There can be no physical basis for the argument if life doesn't exist. There can be no reason for the argument if life doesn't exist. After all, if nobody is really alive, why argue with anyone? If you don't exist as an individual, and you must be alive to exist as an individual, and I don't exist as an individual, why should a non-existent you argue anything to a non-existent me? It doesn't make any sense. So the statement that life is an illusion is contradicted in the making of the very statement. But furthermore, the claim that early2it made is that because everything consists of matter and energy, and life allegedly doesn't fit within that, that means life must be an illusion. Well, I have to say, first of all, that what is the basic unit of existence is not matter or energy. Matter is a quality of things, entities. Entities are the fundamental existence. Entities have qualities, such as matter, volume, color, to give a few examples, and an entity is the sum of its qualities. But it isn't just matter. Matter cannot exist on its own without being a quality of an entity. And also, along with matter, an entity must have other qualities such as length, width, height, a temporal existence, and so forth. And I explain this in considerable depth in my treatise, A Rational Cosmology, to which I've provided a link in the references section accompanying this presentation. Now, life is also an existent. It is a relationship that occurs among the parts, among the constituent parts of certain entities. Life is a physical process. It is a purely physical process which exists on a certain level of complexity, a certain series of relationships, essentially, among the constituent physical entities, none of which is individually alive. And in order to understand how this is the case, it's important to recognize that there exist spontaneous orders in the universe, and also emergent properties that occur as a result of these spontaneous orders. Now, Let's think of a simpler analogy. You have a bunch of pieces of wood lying around in a pile. They don't really have any other function except as pieces of wood. But let's say a carpenter comes along and arranges them in the form of a chair. That chair has properties other than just the sum of all those pieces within the pile of wood. What has changed is the spatial arrangement of these pieces of wood. So now the chair has a distinct functionality that the sum of the pieces of wood didn't have. What changes within a spontaneous order is the relative orientation, either in terms of spatial location or other properties of the constituent parts. And not one of these constituent parts is aware of its role in the larger spontaneous order. Just as, for instance, in larger human societies, when we buy and sell, we are not individually aware of all the economic effects of our decisions on the larger marketplace. Yet, for instance, the equilibrium level of prices is determined by our buying and selling for our own self-interest without, really, our consciously intending to direct the equilibrium level of prices. This happens on every level of organization, from the smallest to the most macroscopic. It happens on levels of organization far past individual human beings. We are all parts of larger spontaneous orders in our economy, for instance. So, life is one such spontaneous order. No individual atom within our body is alive. What is alive is the system, because the atoms are located relative to one another in certain configurations, and they also, because of these configurations, are able to interact with one another via certain processes. Now, certain atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules come together to form cells. Cells come together to form tissues. Tissues come together to form organs. Organs come together to form our entire body. And this process of increasing complexity took billions of years to come about chronologically. But here we are. We cannot deny that this spontaneous order exists because on this particular level, through consciousness, which is another spontaneous order, we are directly aware of it. So life is not an illusion. We grasp it directly, and we can explain it through the concept of emergent properties. Yes, we are all material, and life is a material process. However, that doesn't make it an illusion. That makes it all the more real. Death is when this process is disrupted. That's when something bad happens so that the process doesn't function anymore, and that this complex spontaneous order disintegrates and becomes a series of simpler orders, such as a bunch of bacteria essentially digesting our flesh and organs, which is essentially the process of bodily decay. So, as you can see, life is quite real. Death is also quite real, but it is a reversion to a simpler order. And we, our own existence, are inextricably tied to the complex order. And this is why we must preserve that complex order. If you watch my video, Life is the Origin and Basis of Morality, you will see how no ethical system can extricate itself from the fact that those who are espousing it are living and rational beings. In order to have any kind of self-consistent ethical system, we must take the value of our lives as granted and as assumed. Well, thank you very much. I hope I have laid to rest the idea that life is an illusion.